Welcome back. It is time to begin adolescence. Oh no, that period of time we all recall so vividly. In this chapter, chapter 14, we will be covering psychobiological development. Now, it's important to note the age range that's listed for adolescence. It's very different from any of the previous ones. I guess with middle childhood, I put puberty as the ending point, so I guess that was a harbinger of what was to come. This is kind of a vague period of time because it's going to be different for different people. If we're going to use puberty as the defining factor that determines that a person has entered into adolescence, that's going to vary for people. And then if we're going to use the entry into emerging adulthood as the end of adolescence, that's going to be a little tricky too. Typically, we talk about adolescence being from about 12 to about 18, but you're going to see as we go through our conversation why I'm acting like maybe we shouldn't have hard, fast numbers associated with this period of time. All right, let's just get started and see what we're going to find out. All right, so you guys probably all recall the joy that we call puberty, right? As we're going through physical changes that are going to convert us from children into adults, right? Into physical adults. So this chart here is just sort of an overview where you can see the comparison where things start to happen for girls a little bit earlier than they start to happen for boys. The ovaries start to produce the hormones that are going to trigger the onset of puberty. At about 9 for girls, the testes start to produce the male hormones around 9.5. And then you're going to see that all along, girls are a little bit ahead of boys with regard to physical development. Now, this probably is not a huge surprise to you because you all had the pleasure of going through puberty and you saw the disparity between girls and boys in middle school. Girls are a little farther ahead developmentally as far as physical appearance than boys. So I just wanted to show you kind of concretely that you definitely were observing something that is documented. But we'll break down all of these changes as we go on through this lecture, through this chapter. All right. One thing I really wanted to emphasize is that the sequence is very predictable. We know that once the ovaries start producing estrogen and progesterone, that's going to trigger the uterus and vagina to start to grow. For example, once the testes start to produce testosterone, it's going to cause the testes and scrotum to start to grow. So we know that, one thing is going to trigger the next thing and then the next thing and so on. What we don't know is the timing. So for the average age to be 9 for girls to have the beginning of hormones being secreted from their ovaries and 9.5 for boys, those are averages. Some people will be well ahead of that and some people will be well behind that. There's a wide range of what we call normal, where 95% of people will fall within this really wide range. So the most noticeable events that we're going to be able to really, as individuals, pay attention to probably would be menarche for girls, where they get their first period. First ejaculation for boys are probably going to be really big notable things that are going to happen. And there's a really wide range of that. For girls, the average age is 12 for menarche, but we have girls as young as 8, and they're within the 95% range, and we have girls 18 who haven't had their periods yet. There's a very wide range, and same thing for boys. There's a really wide range of what is considered normal. So, but the problem with that is that there's all this social stuff that goes along with maturation that makes it so much more complicated. So we're going to go ahead and talk about how for boys and for girls, and I know my girls are not necessarily just under the girl part, and my boys aren't just under the boy part. What you can really see in these pictures is this change in the size and shape of their bodies, and that's what everybody else is cueing on and treating them based on, right? And so if everybody's varying, and some people still have their child body and some people have their completely adult body, it can cause a lot of difficulty in middle school especially. So, all right, let's talk about what we mean by the sequence is predictable, the timing is not. So for girls, we oftentimes refer to the onset being about 10 because what we usually are looking for are these external signs. So the first external signs would be the breast buds around 10 years old. For boys, it's going to be about 12 years old when you start to see some outward physical changes starting to happen. What's driving that is this, what we call the HPG axis. The hypothalamus is the H, in that. The pituitary gland is the P, and the gonads are the G. So the hypothalamus is a structure in your limbic system in your brain, and it sends out what is called gonadotropin-releasing hormone that activates the pituitary gland to start secreting luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Now those two circles, I didn't make this picture, I got it off the internet. Those two circles kind of make it seem like luteinizing hormone is above the testes and follicle-stimulating hormone is above the ovaries. That's not how you should be looking at this. Both sexes secrete luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Those are the hormones that activate the gonads, testes in the male, ovaries in the female, to produce their primary hormones. So for the testes, that'll be testosterone, and for the ovaries, that's going to be estrogen and progesterone. So what we don't really know for sure is all the factors that go into triggering the hypothalamus to start releasing gonadotropin-releasing hormone. There are a lot of things that have been considered, like genetic predispositions, because we do see differences between ethnic groups. We look at environmental factors because we do see differences in urban versus rural, high stress circumstances versus lower stress circumstances. So there's some external things like that. There are dietary issues. There are exposure to toxins or endocrine disruptors. I mean, there are a lot of things that we're looking at to try and figure out exactly what naturally happens that flips that switch in the hypothalamus that causes it to start secreting gonadotropin-releasing hormone. All I can say is that once it's flipped, it starts the process of maturation. And the switch will get flipped at different times for different people. So the sequence is predictable, but the onset is not. So let's look at these genes, health, and environment factors. I thought, you know what? My chart on that is later when we talk about menarche. Okay, so we know we have narrowed it down to some degree of interaction of genes, health, and environment that determines the onset of puberty for an individual. The first thing that we oftentimes look at is the growth spurt. And I've been telling you throughout this entire class that finally at puberty, we will stop having the cephalocaudal and proximodistal development that we've been seeing throughout since conception. Finally at puberty, we're going to see the legs get longer, the shoulders get broader, the hands and feet get bigger. Suddenly those distal areas, those caudal areas are going to be developing first. Here's a diagram that illustrates the size of the head relative to the body at different ages. And so they put the individuals, sort of at the same basic height, so you can really see how the head gets smaller relative to the body by the time we're an adult. So the body is finally going to be doing all that growth that'll allow the head to stay relatively the same size, and the body will finally get bigger. So we're finally leaving cephalocaudal, and we're also going to see that the hands and feet grow really fast, the legs and arms grow really fast, so we're going to get rid of that proximodistal finally. So here, if you look back to your years in middle school and wonder why all the girls on average were taller than all the boys on average, it's because the girls reach their height growth spurt about 2 to 3 years earlier than boys reach their height growth spurt. So it was not in our imaginations that it seemed like the girls were on average taller than the boys for a period of time. And of course, these are averages. So some girls were shorter than the boys throughout middle school and then grew in high school. Some girls grew in elementary school. Some boys grew early. Different people have different patterns, but on average, girls will reach their growth spurt before boys will. All right, let's talk a little bit about girls and specifically about primary sex characteristics. All right, so I've just taken my little table that I made and moved it over to just the girls. So when we talk about primary sex characteristics, we're going to be talking about any organs or changes that need to occur that are necessary for reproduction. So I'm going to highlight just the ones that are relevant. So of course the ovaries need to start producing estrogen and progesterone. Without those, nothing else is going to happen that's going to make the person reproductively capable. The uterus and the vagina need to grow into adult size. Menarche needs to occur. And then the first ovulation will have to occur, because until the person starts ovulating, she's not going to be fertile. So what I want you to notice is these relative years, right? We have some progesterone and estrogen flowing through the girl's body well before she ever reaches menarche, right? Like there's a bunch of stuff that's going to be changing and developing that's pretty noticeable in certain ways and also very internal in other ways. And so menarche is going to be the first for sure outward sign to the girl that she has actually reached, maturity. Now, of course, still secret and maybe unknown to the girl is that first ovulation probably won't happen for another year on average. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how over the course of recent history, we've noticed what's called a secular trend in girls' development. And when I say recent history, I mean the past 150 years or something like that. The secular trend where if you look across the generations, you see that girls are reaching menarche younger than they once did. So if you look over at like 1840 is our earliest data, and it's coming out of Denmark. The purple line is Denmark. And then it looks like Norway started collecting data shortly thereafter. And so what they were doing was asking girls and women, how old were you when you got your first menses? And so the women were giving and the girls were giving their retrospective accounts of how old they were. Any women who are listening to me right now are familiar with that question when you go to see a doctor. Like you could be at the doctor for the most benign, unrelated to anything having to do with reproduction kind of checkup, and they'll ask you how old you were when you had your first period. Like it's a very common question. It has some things to do with health. It has some, it can contribute to understanding about, breast health for one thing, brain development, other things. I mean, there are a lot of factors that actually onset of menarche has an impact for. So I think it's partly a reasonable question, but it's certainly one that anybody who has been to the doctor and who is, has had their first period, you're always asked, how old were you when you had your first period? So more and more countries got online starting to collect this data, and so that it starts getting quite overlapped and noodly by the end. But I think we can all agree that that line is going down to the right. So what you're seeing is that, the earliest data was reporting age at first period being over 17 on average. And then as we go down across time, by 1910, if you were to average all of those little lines together, you'd probably be looking at something around 15, maybe 14 3/4, something like that. And then as we keep going down by 2010, we're seeing that the average, if you were to average all those little noodles together, would probably be somewhere around 13. So worldwide, at least in the countries that we have data from, and of course these are largely, Northern European countries that are on this list, except for the US. We don't even have Canada on this list. So we've got, there's no Mexico, there's nothing, so a lot of ethnic variation is not being represented in this chart, is what I'm trying to argue. So you see that, our range is looking like somewhere between 12 and 14, and with an average somewhere around 13 based on these countries. Now that little zoom in is showing you that if you were just to look from 1970 to 2000, you would come to the conclusion that there's been really no change in age of onset of puberty for girls, the age of onset of menarche. It's when you zoom back and you look across, all this data, that you start to realize across generations there has been a drop in age of first period. It has been dropping incrementally, like a month at a time, over the past 40 years kind of thing. But one of the big questions, sorry about that, one of the big questions that people have been having is whether it's going to keep going down and how young can it get. And, of course we don't know. We have to look at this again in like 100 years and we'll know whether there has continued to be a decline. But if you just look at Denmark, you see that it's a pretty rapid decline up until about 1940, and then it's kind of leveled off. It's not as dramatic of a decline for them. And so I think you can see that also with the Germany data, right? Pretty dramatic decline all the way up to about 1940. Then it kind of leveled off and actually got a little older after 1990. So, it's kind of, and you see that with the black little black bar that's Poland. It went up again after 1980. And so we're not exactly sure what the future holds, of course, but we do know that over the past, I guess, gosh, we're coming up on, that's almost 200-year-old data, isn't it? 1830. Now, here's what I thought I was showing you earlier, is this chart that kind of looks at what factors go into, at least for girls, the onset of menstruation. And so in the center, we have the predisposing genetic factors. So, all of us inherit from our ancestors our predispositions to develop in our pattern that we're going to develop. So we absolutely have to have those factors in the center, and those are impacting other things, right? Like in the case of girls, it's affecting, intrauterine growth and while they were in the womb, and sexual differentiation and postnatal growth and the timing of puberty and their degree of fertility and how much weight they tend to put on or how tall they're likely to get and how much adipose tissue they're likely to carry, and then sensitivity to insulin and the control of potential diseases, like how resistant they might be to things. So you've got these predisposing genetic factors that have an impact on all of those things. But then we have these external factors like stress or nutrition or things that might be present in the environment, like it's hard to think of environmental impacts that are not going to ultimately be having an impact on stress, nutrition. So it's kind of hard to think of those things. But the situation in which you find yourself, urban or rural, those kinds of environmental impacts. And then chemical products that disrupt the endocrine system, like fertilizers and certain components of plastics and stuff like that. So all of these things are outside the individual that are going to impact that the way that the predisposing genetic factors actually express themselves, right? A lot of people have spent a lot of time looking at chemical products and tried to look to see whether plastics and fertilizers and things like that can disrupt the endocrine system sufficiently to actually have a big impact on the onset of puberty. And it turns out that the best explanation for when they've looked at all these environmental factors for altering the age of onset of for contributing to this secular trend of younger and younger menarche is nutrition. As we have gotten more and more food secure in the developed countries, girls have been able to start putting on weight earlier, and it turns out that there's a sort of a critical height-weight balance that helps to trigger the onset of the gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that height-weight balance seems to be about 5 feet tall and about 100 pounds. Now, there are a lot of women in the world who are never going to be 5 feet tall, and they're never going to be as heavy as 100 pounds, and they still menstruate. So it's obviously these are averages. But for the average girl who's going to be 5 feet tall or taller and is going to weigh 100 pounds or more in her lifetime, that seems to be the critical tipping point. And it's a ratio, right? So 5 feet and 100 pounds is like a ratio of bones and muscle to fat. And what seems to be super critical for triggering the onset of first period is a sufficient reserve of fat on the body. Now, you don't want too much fat on the body. Come to find out, if you have more than 30% body fat, that can interfere with menstruation also. So it looks like it's like this critical balancing act of this ideal amount of weight, fat to muscle and bone density that will help to trigger the gonadotropin releasing hormone to start to be secreted. So that is our best explanation at the moment, that everything else distills out. Nutrition seems to be the one thing that very consistently differentiates the early menstruating countries. They've been looking at places like Papua New Guinea, where people still live in a very hunter-gatherer style and things like that, and they have the later onset menstruation, right? But you take a person out of Papua New Guinea and raise them in a culture where they're going to have plenty of access to the kinds of diet that would cause them to build up fat earlier, and they become an earlier menstruator. So it looks like that's the best explanation for now, at least, is that all of these things impact, but nutrition seems to be like that tipping point. All right, let's go ahead and take a break here. We'll come back and we'll talk about boys in the next section.